today you're going to hear an outline of the speech I plan to give at Harvard in protest of the attempt by Harvard students to ban people who had anything to do with the Trump administration. I'm going to get invited to Harvard. I'm going to speak at Harvard, and I'm going to make a very provocative speech in which I talk about some of the good things that came out of the Trump administration, something the students and the faculty won't want to hear, but they're going to hear it because I'm going to say it, and you're going to hear it today on The Dirt Show. So here's the speech I'm going to offer to give at Harvard University about Donald Trump. The students will try to ban me because, as you know, there's been a petition circulating saying that anybody who had any association with Donald Trump or the Trump administration, and I defended President Trump on the floor of the Senate against, in my view, unconstitutional impeachment grounds. The petition says that anybody who fits into that category, and I guess I fit into that category, either won't be allowed to speak or will be vetted. I don't know what that means. Will be subject to what? Re-education. Will have to admit their crimes and their moral turpitude. And maybe then they'll be allowed to give a kind of censored, accepted speech. No. That's not going to happen. I'm going to get invited to speak at Harvard. Somebody will invite me, some group of students. It could be 5 students. It could be 10 students. And here's the speech I'm going to make. And I'll tell you why I'm going to make it. For 50 years at Harvard, I was the devil's advocate. Everything that was politically correct, I challenged. I taught a course for freshmen called Where Does Your Morality Come From?, in which I started the class by saying, in this seminar, everything you've ever believed is going to be challenged. What you learned from your parents, what you learned from your rabbi, what you learned from your priest, what you learned from your mentors, what you learned from your friends, everything is going to be challenged. I am the devil's advocate. You know where the term comes from? In the Catholic Church, before they make somebody a saint, they have to have a devil's advocate, somebody who stands up on behalf of the devil and makes the case against sainthood. And there are plenty of people who should not have gotten sainthood in the Catholic Church, including the Pope during the Second World War, who unfortunately did not do what he could have done to save Jewish victims. Mixed picture, but shouldn't have gotten sainthood. That's beside the point. The devil's advocate presents that point of view, and that's what I did for 50 years teaching at Harvard Law School. I'm now professor emeritus. There have been some students who've tried to take away my status as professor emeritus because they don't like the fact that I defended President Trump. But I'm going to be invited, and they're going to try to stop me, and there will be security, and I will make a reasoned speech. There will be no shouting. There will be no putting students down. Nobody will have to be afraid. Students will claim they're in fear. Students will claim that they're upset. Hey, that's part of being at a university. So my speech is going to be entitled, basically, The Positive Aspects of the Trump Presidency. Wow, the positive aspects, according to most people that I know at Harvard, there are no positive aspects. All they talk about are the negative aspects, and there are enough of those. And as you know, I didn't vote for President Trump in 2016. I voted for Hillary Clinton. I'm a liberal Democrat. I'm not disclosing my vote in the 2020 election, but that's not relevant. I'm not a, quote, Trump political supporter. I'm not a Republican, but I am somebody who recognizes goodness and virtue and positive aspects and negative aspects. As you know, I voted for Barack Obama, and I condemned him really quite vociferously for the Iran deal and for condemning Israel at the United Nations Security Council, calling the Western Wall illegally occupied territory. So I know how to condemn people I voted for, and I know how to praise people I voted against. And in this speech, in order to give the students what they don't hear at Harvard, I'm going to set out some of the positive aspects of the Trump administration. I'm going to begin by reading a letter I plan to write to the Nobel Prize Committee. I am an official nominator of the Nobel Peace Prize because of my status as an emeritus professor of public law. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize is very clear. It is supposed to go to that person or persons who have done the most during the preceding year to bring about peace between nations, to reduce armies and reduce the prospects of war, and to convene peace conferences or peace negotiations. Well, I challenge anybody to come up with an event that's more deserving of the Nobel Peace Prize than the Abraham Accords. It fits every one of those criteria. It was a peace congress, a peace conference. President Trump, Jared Kushner, and others brought together the emirs of Bahrain and United Arab Emirates and Israel, and normalized relationships, ultimately with the Sudan as well. And there is a possibility that between 8 and 10 other Sunni Arab nations and other nations might soon normalize relationships with Israel. And it's moved very quickly. Israel now has a significant presence in the United Arab Emirates, business, commercial, other ways, political, religious. There are now synagogues and Jewish centers in some of these places that were Judenrein for so many years. Jews were not really welcome or allowed. If you had Israel on your passport, you couldn't fly through any of those countries. People had to use 2 passports. Their American passport, they would be allowed in as long as it wasn't stamped Israel or the Israel passport. That's all changed. And so it's the event, the Abraham Accords, and I will say this in my speech, the Abraham Accords, which deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. And then the question is, which 4 individuals deserve the Nobel Peace Prize for their role in the Abraham Accords? There are 2 possible scenarios there. One, you could name the 4 leaders who are most responsible: President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the emirs of Bahrain and United Arab Emirates. That would be a perfectly reasonable approach to awarding the Nobel Peace Prize. That's the way it was given to Yasser Arafat for the Oslo Accords. That's why it was given to Jimmy Carter, belatedly, for the Camp David Accords, and to many other leaders, many of them quite imperfect, Arafat being the primary example. I have no idea why President Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. I have absolutely no idea. It was just a slap in the face by the Nobel Peace Committee to George W. Bush, because Barack Obama hadn't done anything. He hadn't fulfilled any of the criteria. He just got elected. And within a very short time of his election, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize. I think he was embarrassed by it. He knows he didn't deserve it. And he did nothing during his 4 years to deserve it. He ought to give it back. He's not going to. And I'm not asking him to. But when you compare what these 4 people, Trump, Netanyahu, and the emirs, did in bringing about normalization and peace and reduction of the prospects of war, it just is so much more compelling than anything that some of the other people I've mentioned did to get the Nobel Peace Prize. So one group would be the 4 leaders. Another group would be the 4 people who are most responsible for bringing this about within the Trump administration. That would be President Trump himself, his Jared Kushner, who did a lot of the work along with Avi Berkowitz, and the Secretary of State, Pompeo, and David Friedman, the American ambassador to Israel. That would be another group that would clearly deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think reasonable people could disagree whether it would be the first group or the second group. But no reasonable person could disagree that the Abraham Accords, brought about by the Trump administration, is the event that warrants the Peace Prize. And I will say that at Harvard. Now, I'll try to say it. I will be shouted down. I will be booed. And I will defend the right of people to boo me. I will not defend their right to shout me down. Students have a right to hear what I have to say. I have a right to express my views. They have a right to protest. They have a right to boo. But the booing has to be sporadic and occasional, and it has to be substantive. If I say something, they can boo. They can yell out, disagree, we disagree. They can hold posters at the back of the room, not blocking the view of students. How do I know? Because I wrote those rules. When I was at Harvard, I was part of committees that established free speech rules. I was part of the American Civil Liberties Union, which established these rules in the Bruce Franklin case back in the early 1970s. So I know of which I speak when I talk about my right to speak to Harvard students. So I will speak to them about the Nobel Peace Prize. They will hate hearing that speech, but that's part of being at a university. You're not supposed to love what you hear. If you were brought up as a deeply religious Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever, and you come to Harvard and you learn about evolution, and you learn maybe God didn't create the world in 7 days, maybe the Big Bang Theory is a better explanation. It may pain you, it may hurt you. I remember I came from a religious Jewish background to my university, Brooklyn College, City University in New York, and a number of things I learned did pain me. It hurt me. It made me have to have arguments with my parents. That's part of a university education. So the students will be pained. They will not be frightened. Nobody is going to be frightened of me. Any student who tells you they're frightened, they're scared, they use any of those words that suggest physical harm are lying to you. And students shouldn't be liars. They should tell the truth. And the truth is they are offended by what I say. They disagree with what I say, but they're not afraid of what I say. Indeed, it empowers them. They stand up. They're the majority. My speech will be panned. It'll be panned in the Harvard Crimson. It'll be panned in the Boston Globe. It'll be panned even probably in the Boston Herald. That's okay. I'm making the speech to be panned. I'm making the speech to present the devil's advocate point of view on the Trump administration. So that's point one, the Nobel Peace Prize. Point two, a very obvious point. Most people on the Harvard Law School faculty think I was wrong in defending the president against what I thought were unconstitutional charges of impeachment. I do not believe that abuse of power or obstruction of Congress are constitutionally permissible grounds for impeachment. I will defend my point of view. I will criticize the professors on the Harvard faculty that disagree with me. I will challenge them to debate me on this issue. The students are not going to want to hear it. They wanted Trump impeached, even though I think many of them now probably prefer that he has been defeated, apparently, in the election and will lose his office not as a result of a vote by 100 senators, but as the result of 150 million Americans. But nonetheless, they will strongly oppose what I have to say about impeachment. That will be the second point. The third point I'm going to make is I'm going to be very critical of the current attempts to criminalize Donald Trump, not President Trump, Donald Trump's activities. I'm very strongly opposed to what the Attorney General of New York has done and is doing. The Attorney General of New York, who's a very able lawyer named Letitia James, a prominent lawyer, won fair and square Attorney Generalship of New York. But what was her campaign? She campaigned to be a prosecutor by promising to get Donald Trump, to find crimes to prosecute him for. They didn't have crimes. She didn't know whether he had committed any crimes. Her campaign pledge was to find crimes, and if they found them, then to prosecute or to go after him civilly. Does that remind you of something? It sure does. The famous exchange between Stalin and Lavrenti Beria, the head of the KGB, the notorious KGB. Beria went to Stalin and said to him, "Show me the man, and I'll find you the crime." In other words, point out people you don't like. Point out people who you want to see criminally prosecuted, and I'll search around and I'll find the crime. And if I can't find one, I'll manufacture one. If I can't manufacture one, I'll create a sting. But don't worry, you just give me the name of the people you want to get, and I will go after them. Well, our Constitution protects against that. There's a provision in the text of the Constitution, not even in the amendments. Before the amendments were passed, there were only two prohibitions in the Constitution relating to criminal charges. One is ex post facto, and the other is bills of attainder. Let me explain to you what a bill of attainder is. A bill of attainder was a legislative act passed by the Parliament in England in which the Parliament, the legislature, named people and said, "We hereby declare so-and-so guilty of treason and let him be hanged." The United States Constitution rejected that and said, no bills of attainder. No. The legislature, the executive, they can't name people and prosecute them without them being fairly investigated and fairly prosecuted. And I can't imagine how an attorney general can fairly prosecute and fairly investigate somebody when they've run for office, when they've campaigned and they won. They won election on the promise to get Donald Trump. So I am very much opposed to that. And if Donald Trump were to be investigated and prosecuted and indicted, and were he to ask me to defend him against those criminal charges, I would be the first one to agree to do that, because that is so un-American. That is so unconstitutional. That is so in violation of everything criminal justice is supposed to be. And so those are the three, among other arguments, I'm going to make. I'll probably spend a few minutes also criticizing aspects of the Trump policy, his immigration policy, his separation of children. But, that's not the important part of my talk. Maybe I won't even say it. Why? They hear that every day. They don't need to hear that from me. I'll give it to them only to strike a kind of balance in my talk, because I want to be balanced in my presentation. But that's not the important part of the speech, because they hear the negatives, they hear the criticisms every single day in every forum. They hear it in their dining room, they hear it in their classrooms, they read it in the newspapers, and quite appropriately so. They're entitled to hear the case against the Trump administration, but they're also entitled to hear the case in favor of the Trump administration. And for years, students didn't know what my views were in class, because I don't express my personal views in class. Many students thought I was in favor of the death penalty. I've been a lifelong opponent of the death penalty. But most of my students were against the death penalty. So in class, I made the case, and I made it very effectively and very powerfully in favor of the death penalty. I put it this way. I said, if I could prove to you that by killing one admittedly guilty person, somebody whose murder was recorded on videotape, who admitted the murder, the evidence is overwhelming, no dispute. If we could execute one such murderer, and by doing so prevent 10 innocent people from being murdered, if I can prove to you that the death penalty in that way deters, would you still be opposed to the death penalty? And a number of the students changed their minds on that and said, no, we're not really morally opposed to the death penalty, we're really empirically opposed. Well, if you're empirically opposed, then you'll listen to what the evidence is. So I would take the devil's advocate point of view, and the students sometimes didn't like it. Well, what's your real views on the death penalty? You want to know my real views on the death penalty? I write books, I write op-eds, I speak outside of the classroom, read what you want. But in the classroom, what you're going to hear are devil's advocate arguments, because my job is not to teach you what to think, it's to teach you how to think. It's to make you a better conservative if you came in as a conservative, a better liberal if you came in as a liberal. Look, if you change your mind and became a liberal having been a conservative, or a conservative having been a liberal, that's fine. That's part of a university education too. But you're not going to get that from me. I'm not going to give you the propaganda designed to turn you from a conservative into a liberal. And so the speech I propose to make at Harvard is perfectly appropriate. And I am really anxious to see how the students react to it, how the administration reacts to it. Remember, this is an administration that fired Ron Sullivan as the dean of one of the Harvard colleges, first African-American dean with his wife of a Harvard college. He was fired at the demand of students who said they felt unsafe. They felt unsafe in the presence of a meek, mild-mannered law professor who had agreed for a short period of time to represent Harvey Weinstein. They didn't feel unsafe 2 years earlier when he represented a Boston Patriot wide receiver who was accused and convicted. Ultimately, one of the convictions was reversed, but convicted of gangland murder. Murder! That didn't frighten them. They weren't afraid of Ron Sullivan. They only got afraid of him when he represented Harvey Weinstein, and the administration went along with it, and they fired him to their everlasting shame. So I'm concerned what the administration is going to do in the face of these protests. So far, they have indicated they're not going to comply with them. The president of Harvard's a wonderful man, Larry Bacow, former president of Tufts, a wonderful man, a strong believer in free speech and due process, but he's the president of a university, and the presidents of universities have to listen to all their constituencies, which includes students. Students are not the only constituency. Universities have alumni, faculty, administrators, workers, people who are going to come in the future, donors, you name it. And a president of the university has an impossible job trying to balance the often inconsistent demands of all of those constituencies. So I'm going to put Harvard to the test. People will say, what are you doing this? You're provoking. Yeah. That's part of my job. I have been a provocateur since the day I set foot in Harvard in 1964. I was praised for that when my provocations seemed to support the agendas of the majority of the students and faculty. But when I'm a provocateur that raises questions that are different from the politically correct ones, suddenly the attitude will be different. I'm fairly confident that Harvard will allow me to speak. There'll be boos, that's fine. I'm fairly confident there won't be a direct effort to try to ban me. I may need police protection. I may need the university security. I know the police at Harvard. How do I know the police at Harvard? Because many times my life was threatened, mostly by people on the hard right. I had threats on my life during the years I was at Harvard. I needed FBI agents accompanying me to class a few times. When I spoke in Canada, I needed armed guards on the stage when I spoke in defense of Israel. So I'm used to being protected, and I have a thick skin. I grew up in Brooklyn. I'm a tough guy. I can take criticism. I can take boos. What I can't take is censorship, but I will not accept censorship. And I will not be re-educated. I will not be lectured to. I will not be made to feel guilty because I defended the President of the United States against an unconstitutional impeachment. So, looking forward to my visit to Harvard, either by Zoom if the coronavirus continues, or preferably, much preferably, in person when the virus is over or when the vaccine comes into being, something we all uniformly hope for will happen soon. So please call in. Give me your views of what else I should say in my speech at Harvard. I would love to reflect some of your views. I'd love to say, and my listeners and viewers asked me to say the following, and so I will. So now we'll turn to my listeners and my viewers who provide the wits for the Dirt Show, and let's take your questions. Now we turn to our calls, which I always look forward to because they're always terrific. Our first call is from California.
Professor Dershowitz, I'm a big fan of yours, but I would like to push back on a comment you made in your previous show where you said that the president could not be impeached for any conduct prior to being the president, occupying the office. Suppose, hypothetically, a president was elected, and during the interim, before he transitioned and took the oath of office, there was sufficient evidence, or he was convicted of a high crime and misdemeanor, he would not be able to be impeached. Moreover, it seems to me that the Constitution doesn't specify when this high crime or misdemeanor had to take place.
It's a very good question, but the very concept of high crime, according to Hamilton, who helped draft, who did the Federalist Paper on impeachment, and obviously was an important part of the constitutional drafting. According to Hamilton, a high crime essentially is a crime that's committed while you're in office, a crime of governance. And if you had somebody like Donald Trump, who was a private citizen. Now, you make a good point. What about the transition? The transition, you are officially, if you're recognized as the president-elect, you're officially the president-elect, and that's an office. So it's possible that while you're president-elect, you could be impeached. I'll give you the harder case. What if it turns out that you can prove that a president got elected by committing high crimes and misdemeanors, by forging votes, by doing other things that were high crimes and misdemeanors, and that's what got him elected? I suspect that would be sustained. But the cases I'm talking about is a president who, while in business, may have, and I'm not talking about any particular president, may have committed stock fraud or adultery or cheated on his taxes. I don't think that would be a ground for impeachment. But you're right. There's nothing in the Constitution that speaks directly to that issue. Recall, we did have a vice president once who committed murder while he was serving as vice president. His name was Aaron Burr, and he killed Alexander Hamilton. Now, you might say it wasn't murder because it was a voluntary duel, but dueling was banned in New Jersey at the time, and it was clearly a species of homicide. So you had a vice president of the United States committing a homicide, maybe not a murder, maybe just a manslaughter, but a homicide. And he was not impeached for that, perhaps because he was not going to run for election again. And indeed, he didn't run for vice president again, and he was a private citizen. And then he was indicted for treason. One of the greatest trials in American history was United States versus Aaron Burr, in which he made his own arguments, some of his own arguments, defended himself. Chief Justice John Marshall was the presiding judge at the trial, and he was acquitted in a strange verdict, not proven, which is not an accepted American verdict. It's accepted in Scotland, but not in America. But that's what the jury rendered. They said the case against Burr wasn't proven, and so he went free. But he was never the same again after killing Hamilton. You remember the line in the musical, I'm the damn fool that shot Hamilton, stated by Burr. It obviously ruined his life and ruined his career. But very interesting question, and I think your points are good ones. Maybe I overstated it when I said under no circumstances could a president be impeached for anything he did before inaugural day. I suspect in the transition, or if he did it in order to get elected president, that might be included within impeachable offenses. We probably will never know because these things have never been tested, and it's not clear the Supreme Court would review such a case. So we leave it as an open question. Our next call is from Abu Dair from Texas.
This comment is regarding your recent criticism of Reverend Warnock. No doubt what he said was controversial. However, I do find it hypocritical of you to castigate him for criticizing Israel. Yet Israel itself has been arming and training Azeris in their war against Armenia, which Armenia has sadly lost. Azerbaijan are also backed by the Turks, who incidentally deny the Armenian genocide. Now, if you join the dots, Israel is aiding and training a Turkic nation in its fight against a solitary and a completely surrounded Armenia, which like itself was persecuted to death by the Ottoman Turks. Mm-hmm. And possibly Israel's training of the Azeris tipped the balance in their favor. The lack of any compunction by Israel for the Armenian situation is astounding, and Israel should be roundly criticized, especially since it itself was founded as a byproduct of Nazi persecution. Reverend Warnock criticized the Israeli treatment of Palestinians. Okay, that's open to debate. However, the Armenians who are now going to live under Azeri control will most certainly be massacred like they were before.
You make a very good point. And if Warnock had made your point, I would agree with him. I wouldn't criticize him. I wouldn't urge people not to support him. You make a very good point. That's the kind of nuanced criticism of Israel that's not only acceptable, it's very positive. I happen to agree with a lot of what you said. I don't think Israel has been strong enough in support of Armenia. Look, it's a country. It has to look out for its own interests. But I do think Israel and Armenia have a lot in common. As you know, Hitler pointed to the Armenian genocide as a kind of prelude to the genocide against the Jews. He said nobody cared that so many Armenians were killed. Nobody will care about the Jews as well. So nuanced criticism of Israel, I support. I do it myself. But what Warnock said was not nuanced criticism of Israel, accusing Israel of deliberately gunning down innocent, unarmed Palestinian children like birds of prey. That's a blood libel. Failure to mention terrorism, terror tunnels, rockets, comparing the Berlin Wall, which is designed to keep good people out of West Berlin, to Israel's security fence, which is designed to keep terrorists from killing Israeli civilians. Those are obnoxious, non-nuanced, biased, bigoted, not criticisms of Israel, but demonization of Israel. So I stand by my criticism of Warnock, and I accept your criticism of Israel. And I say if Warnock had been as sensible as you are, we wouldn't be having this discussion. I'd be supporting him. Our next call is from one of my favorite cities, New Orleans. Mike.
I think the answer to your dilemma on the Senate candidate, Democrat Senate candidate, with a checkered past with regard to the Jewish state is easier than a lot of people have said. You yourself have said that everyone has a choice. Even if you do nothing, that is a choice. If you can't support him, then you don't have to support him. To my knowledge, I don't think you're registered in Georgia, so it wouldn't necessarily be a voting issue, just an issue of do you contribute financial money or not. And if you don't contribute to him, it doesn't mean that you have to contribute to a Republican candidate. You can choose to do nothing. And if I were in your position where I was conflicted by my party alliance versus the individual candidate, and as I think many probably do for President Trump, in fact, you choose to simply not cast a vote, not support in either direction. You can choose to do nothing.
That's a great point, but I can't choose to do nothing because people ask me my opinion all the time, and I write about these things. I'm not going to contribute to Warnock's campaign. I get an email a day from Warnock asking me to contribute to his campaign. I always respond by quoting my article and asking him to respond to me. He does it. But I can't do nothing. I'm going to have to take a position on this because I am a Democrat. I take positions generally on these kinds of matters. I don't vote in Georgia, you're right. And I have contributed to the campaigns of Democrats and Republicans on occasion. But in general, I take positions when it comes to who's going to control the Senate. So the question is not voting or even contributing, it's speaking out. And I'm going to speak out and alert the public to what Warnock said both in his sermon and in the statement that he signed on to along with other people. I'm going to wait for him to respond. I hope he will. I hope he'll make me change my mind. If he does, I will come out in support of his candidacy. And if he doesn't, I will come out in opposition to his candidacy. But it's not my style just to do nothing. But I appreciate your call. Our next call is from Howard in California.
Professor Dershowitz, you said that election fraud is generally a state matter and not of interest to the federal government unless there's some sort of special civil rights violation. Well, I challenge you, if you were going to make that argument that denying or fairly counting the votes is somehow a federal concern, what argument would you make for that election fraud is a matter of interest to the federal government?
It's a good point. In general, retail fraud, whether a person should have been able to vote or shouldn't have been able to vote, was he dead or alive, did he live in the state or didn't he, is a matter of state law, and the challenge has to be made to state election commissions and ultimately perhaps to the state courts. But there could come a time when massive state fraud could become a federal issue. It could constitute a denial of equal protection. After all, if thousands of improper votes are cast, those who cast proper votes have lost the power of their votes. Their votes are diluted by the number of improper votes that are cast. And that's, of course, what the Supreme Court said in Bush versus Gore when they went to the equal protection analysis. So there may come a time when voter fraud becomes a federal issue, but initially it's an issue of state law. And remember, again, presidential elections are 50 state elections, and the states, under the Constitution, the state legislatures determine how electors are to be selected. Our next call is from Florida. Tony?
You're on the horns of a dilemma. You have a choice of one of two decisions to make with regarding Reverend Warnock. If you support him, us Democrats potentially gain control of the Senate. And I don't see what harm to Israel there is in that. If you don't support him, there's a greater chance that the Republicans gain control of the Senate. And I don't see what harm there is to Israel in that. So either decision you make, I don't see the harm to Israel. But in the decision, if you went with supporting Reverend Warnock, you get the advantage of a Democratic-controlled Senate. So just from a utilitarian point of view, the greater benefit to society and everyone as a whole, with no problem for Israel comes from supporting Reverend Warnock.
Well, I very much appreciate your Benthamite utilitarian or John Stuart Mill utilitarian analysis. I just disagree with the weight. I don't think that having him in the Senate as such will influence necessarily lots of votes of the Senate. He's just one senator. But the idea of having a United States senator who has views of that kind legitimates those views and gives them a sense of acceptance by the Democratic Party. I'll give you a specific example. The man running for the Senate in the other race, John Ossoff, who, as far as I know, has never expressed any anti-Israel views, has supported Warnock. And so he's legitimated those views. And I'm sure many other Democratic senators support Warnock and thereby legitimate his views. And so I think it would be a bad thing, not only for Israel, but for America and for the world, to have somebody who holds views like that as a United States senator. Look, you flatter me by saying you think my statements can actually influence the outcome of elections. I don't think so, but I have a responsibility to express my views, and these are strongly held views. And you're right, I'm on the horns of a dilemma, and I've resolved the dilemma right now by saying unless Warnock can persuade me that he has actually changed his views, and unless he renounces the views he previously expressed in both the sermon and in the statement he signed on to, I will not be able to support him. That doesn't mean I'm going to contribute to his opponent. It doesn't mean I'm going to urge people to vote Republican. I'm just not going to support him. And if people ask me, do you support Warnock? I'm going to say no. And if you ask me if I lived in Georgia, would I vote for Warnock? I'm going to say no. And whatever influence I might have, so be it. But I agree with doing utilitarian calculus. I just don't think you give sufficient weight to the legitimacy factor of having a United States senator. I throw it back at you. What if there were a Southern segregationist senator who could be the one to tip over to the Democrats, but there would be a senator who supported segregation, as there was, of course, for many, many years, many of them Democrats. I could not vote for such a person, and I could not imagine any African-American person voting for a segregationist or a white supremacist, even if it meant control of the Democrats. Also, you have to ask the question, why did the Democrats support a candidate who has views like this? I remember the Republicans really got very tough on a particular person who had expressed anti-Semitic or certainly very strongly anti-Israel views. Parties have a responsibility to nominate people who reflect the mainstream of their party, and I don't think Reverend Warnock, I hope Reverend Warnock doesn't represent, at least the statements that I'm talking about, don't represent the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and I don't want it ever to, and that's why I can't support him unless he renounces those views. Our final call for today is from Hugh. What's your point?
My fear is not that the Harvard students and people like them are going to set up an actual American gulag. My fear is that they're going to create a virtual gulag. They'll create a database of names of untouchables that every woke HR director will check before considering applications. With modern technology, it'd be easy to gather names and add them to a list. It'll be an American version of the Chinese social credit system. It doesn't need to be run by the government, and it will virtually guarantee that at first Trump supporters, then Republicans, and then eventually anyone who doesn't totally agree with the woke agenda will be frozen out of jobs, benefits, perks. It'll all be hidden. It'll be impossible to prove, but it will be very effective. This is what I'm afraid of. Professor, what can we do to stop this? What legally can we do to stop this?
Well, the first thing is to listen to people like you. You make an excellent point. I agree with you. I think the fear is that it will go under the radar, that the university will overtly reject this call for a blacklist. And remember, AOC has called for a blacklist. She wants the name of everybody, and she wants them held accountable, and she wants to make sure that universities don't invite them and businesses don't hire them. It's pure McCarthyism. That's what McCarthy did. That's what Red Channels was. It was a secret list of alleged communist fellow travelers, sympathizers, lawyers who shouldn't be allowed to be on television. If any of you saw the great Woody Allen movie, The Front, it was all about that. And Zero Mostel played the TV character who in the end commits suicide because he couldn't get employment. He was based on actually a character in a TV sitcom called The Goldbergs, Molly Goldberg, in which the husband was banned, or the uncle, I forget which one, but was banned by red channels. And we know that Hollywood just wouldn't hire these people, and that's why you had to have people be fronting for other people. Some of the greatest screenplays during that period of time were written by banned writers who sent their scripts to other people because their names couldn't be used on them, Dalton Trumbo and others. So we lived through this. We're just seeing a replication. Ignoramuses like AOC who have no knowledge of history, no appreciation for the past, no appreciation for the philosopher who said, unless we learn the lessons of the past, we're destined to repeat them. We are repeating McCarthyism. And McCarthyism came fully with secret lists, blacklists, with decisions made under the radar by admissions offices, by other offices, by people who select speakers, by people who select recipients of honorary degrees, all of that. That's going to happen unless we stop it. It can be stopped legally at public universities, a little harder at private universities. Harvard University, because it's in Massachusetts, is subject to the state civil rights law, which does cover private universities in certain instances. I've won cases against universities based on the Massachusetts civil rights law. I think other states may have comparable civil rights laws. When it comes to University of California or the City University of New York or the State University of New York, they're all covered by the First Amendment. And so there you can bring legal challenges. But on this show, I'm going to keep tabs on this. You're going to hear from me all the time about what's going on at Harvard. It's now spreading to Princeton. It will spread to Yale. It will spread to other schools. It will spread to the University of Chicago, which has a long history of support for freedom of speech and some great statements by presidents. But the students will be pushing for this kind of McCarthyism. We have to fight it. This show, The Der Show, is battlefield central for the fight against censorship, for the fight against McCarthyism. Please tell any of your friends, any of your colleagues who care about this censorship, who care about McCarthyism, subscribe to The Der Show. Listen, view The Der Show. This is Battle Center. This is where you're going to hear reports about it all the time. This is where we fight back against McCarthyism and censorship. So please keep tuning in to The Der Show. An important part of The Der Show is your voice, your questions, your comments. Please call 24/7. The number is 216-710-0050. Keep your comments short and to the point. Again, the number for you to call 24/7 is 216-710-0050. Hard questions, criticisms, everything's fine. Just keep your questions short, and I'll answer them all on The Der Show.